Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. I'm Jake Wynn. Justin Voigthofer is away this week, so I'm joined by my friend and public historian and previous guest on the podcast, Rich Condon. We are back this week to discuss the final episodes 5 through 7 of Manhunt on Apple TV Plus, as we finish out our series about this miniseries that focuses on the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln and the hunt for his killer. And because we are feeling not so great about that series itself, we are also going to be chatting about another topic this week that is near and dear to our hearts, and that is some pretty terrible historical markers that are out there on the landscape around America, specifically in down south. We'll get talking about that a little bit later. So we have one episode here, and we have two topics about public history to focus on. So before we start, I want to ask my guest co-host, Rich, how are you this week?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. It's been an interesting week in public history.
Yes, it has been. There's a lot going on. I feel like public history in the 2020s is uh, it's definitely a field that has lots of interesting things happening all the time. I think that this is a particularly timely era in which to start a podcast up on this topic, because I feel like we can have lots of discussions about how history is kind of being discussed in the field of politics and popular culture, education. It really is intersecting with a lot of aspects of American life these days. So, and in this episode, we're going to get into a little bit of both of those, a little bit of both the popular culture side of things, and then also kind of a little bit of politics, but mostly about the landscape, the historical landscape where monuments and historical markers are located. So excited to dive into both of these topics, but we're going to start this week with finishing out our series on Manhunt, which a reminder, this is an Apple TV Plus miniseries, focuses on uh, telling very loosely the story told in the book Manhunt, which is the 12-day hunt for the killers of Abraham Lincoln. And this series has firmly gone off the rails by episodes 5 through 7. These are the concluding episodes where we see the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, tracking him down in Virginia to the Garrett farm, the burning of the barn. We get to meet his killer, John Wilkes Booth's killer, a fascinating fella named Boston Corbett. And we see Booth's death. We're calling this episode useless. Those are the final words that John Wilkes Booth states as he's dying on the porch of the Garrett farm in Virginia. And then ultimately in these episodes, we also see the trial that follows. This is and I can't state this enough, this is a highly fictionalized version of the events that took place. Plenty of artistic license in these episodes, and it is very loosely following the Manhunt story by James Swanson. With all of that being said, I'm curious, Rich, for your opinions on these concluding episodes of Manhunt. What did you think about it? Did you enjoy these episodes? I would love to get your thoughts on this.
All right, so yes, as we kind of discussed in our the last episode that I had participated in with you and Justin, um, again, Edwin Stanton is again upping his frequent flyer miles. He's going everywhere searching for John Wilkes Booth. Even and in fact, I just watched the final episode a couple of nights ago. My good friend Chris Barr from Reconstruction era National Historical Park was up here, and we delve into these things in our free time, and we watched the final episode, and um, one of the things I did not realize too about Boston Corbett, the man who shoots John Wilkes Booth. is that he was released out of Andersonville prison just a couple of months before this takes place, before he kills John Wilkes Booth. The guy who plays him, of course, looks very healthy. He's obviously not been in a Confederate prison camp anytime recently. Kind of looking at that too, I was thinking, is this situation is unfolding, uh, the final kill or capture of John Wilkes Booth. Edwin Stanton is receiving um, active communication from the ground, as if they have, I don't know, walkie talkies or cell phones telling him what's happening in Virginia. Anyway, basically the same stuff from earlier episodes is kind of carrying on as far as the storytelling goes. Honestly, I think by the end of it, I was kind of good. Like, I just wanted to get through it.
Yeah, I had the
I'm
same.
sorry to put it that way so bleakly.
I no, I mean, I had the same reaction. I found it almost painful to finish watching this because by these episodes, I just felt very, very disconnected from any of these characters, even from the story itself. And I think it's in part, like we discussed in the last recaps that we did for episodes 3 and 4, having read the book that this is based on while this was airing, rereading it in my case. I just come away with the fact that these are almost two different stories. One that trends very closely to the historical narrative in Swanson's book. That is, while it does take some artistic license, I think with putting thoughts in people's minds that it just can't really know what they're thinking in these situations. You can surmise, and I think that they're a very very good approximations, I would imagine, of what some of these characters thought in these situations. And then you have the TV adaptation, which is just um, it takes the story and runs in some very odd directions with kind of the conspiracy in mind, with
Right.
tying in Jefferson Davis into this whole thing, and making it into this story that doesn't really at all resemble the historical narrative that we have from the primary sources, from the accounts of the people who are there, and from what actually happened in some of these places. So um,
I will give some credit. I know. I just talked a little bit of smack, but um, when talking about, again, I think I mentioned this in our last discussion, the discussion of Reconstruction. I think it does, and like you kind of just mentioned now, there are like a couple of different stories that peel off of this main, I guess, this main story of the run and capture of John Wilkes Booth, but it also kind of branches off into, Edwin Stanton's story of Reconstruction, and kind of, his really difficult relationship with President Andrew Johnson, and kind of his version or his vision of Reconstruction, is the war has effectively come to an end. One thing I thought was kind of interesting is, you know, they kind of rushed the timeline a little bit, a lot of it, when they have, Lorenzo Thomas is Andrew Johnson's, ideal leader for, as Secretary of War, head of the War Department. They do show at one point, Edwin Stanton, this severe asthmatic who's been down with the sickness. I don't know why I said it like that. Yeah. Of course, when Booth is finally getting taken out, they show him pushing, this big heavy wooden desk and other things from his office up against the door, and essentially barricading himself inside of his office, preventing Lorenzo Thomas from taking his position as Secretary of War. And that is something that actually happened. He did uh, essentially barricade himself in his office for about 3 months, preventing that kind of transition of power that Johnson was trying to implement. And of course, this ultimately leads to Johnson's impeachment and trying to remove Stanton. But I digress. I do like they start leading into that story a little bit, although that could probably be another series in itself.
Yeah, it felt very much to me at times like that they're trying to stuff a Reconstruction story into 12 days of hunting for John Wilkes Booth, and it doesn't
Yes.
make a lot of sense. There's the timeline is so compressed, and they're trying to, and they have these flashbacks going on. It's timeline wise, it's a mess. It feels like this is the wrong venue for telling that story in the way that they're trying to tell it is kind of the way that I came away feeling, about this. I love that, and we've talked about this before too. The fact that these stories are being told in this sort of setting is really great. I just after 7 episodes of this, it's like I don't know. I don't think that this worked in a
Yeah.
storytelling capacity. In some ways, it feels like just a series of loosely connected vignettes that don't really have anything to do. They don't do a good job of pulling it, weaving the story all together to make a cohesive narrative of how this is all tied together. Is sort of how I ended up feeling about it after concluding the series. Um, there is, a few things that I just want to pull out that I was just kind of honestly sort of like baffled by. Uh, in some one case amused by, in another case made quite angry by these episodes and just their portrayal of Manhunt. One of them I think is just the fact that Edwin Stanton is out riding with the cavalry leading the hunt in Virginia for Booth, I think is just really amusing. Um, I don't understand. Like we bring in Lafayette Baker as a character. We see him in the first couple of episodes, and then he just sort of disappears. But he is directly tied to the hunt. In fact, his I believe it's his cousin Luther Baker, and then Luther Baker's best friend Everton Conger, I believe is his name. They're the ones that are leading this band of cavalry soldiers, and they're communicating back with Lafayette Baker. Ultimately, they're hunting the bounty. They are seeking the money, and that's their purpose. And I think that's a much more compelling story than what we're getting here. Is like the fact that they're motivated purely by compensation, getting the money for capturing Booth and Harold. Um, but there's a scene with Stanton when he goes into what is it, Bowling Green, Virginia, looking for Willie Jett, who's one of the Confederates that is the Confederate that told Booth and
Right.
to go to the Garrett farm. And Stanton comes up and introduces himself at a hotel, and he's like, Edwin Stanton. Puts out his hand, Secretary of War, and just like the absurdity of that. And then Willie Jett, just like in one of the most bizarre pieces of writing in this whole series, is just like with a what is presumed to be like a lady of the night, and just being like, "Well, I have plans. I'll be able to talk to you in about an hour." And I was like, gross, man. Why? What is this? What is this? Um, so that one amused me. The one that sort of made me angry happened just a scene or two earlier when we see Booth and Harold trying to cross the Rappahannock River at Port Royal, Virginia. And a scene that really did take place. Booth and Harold get in with a group of ex-Confederate soldiers returning home from the army, and who are crossing the Rappahannock River and interacting. Booth and Harold interact with a Confederate soldier who becomes very skeptical of them. They have a story that they were wounded, that Booth was wounded, and that they were returning home as well. Um, and in the story that we see on the television show, we hear Booth say, just kind of absurdly, that he had been wounded at Bull Run, which is, he's wearing a First Texas hat, They're not at first bull run. Or the fact they're calling it Bull Run and not Manassas is a big tell, as well as the Confederates referred to it as Manassas. Um, the first Texas is at second Manassas, second Bull Run. So that's 2.5 years earlier. And then this Confederate soldier also says that he was wounded at Bull Run. And so I'm just wondering, you know, left wondering, like, is the Confederate Army just made up of invalids, of wounded guys crutching around the battlefield for 2.5 years? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In the book, the Booth states to these Confederate soldiers that he had been wounded at Petersburg, which makes a lot more sense considering it had ended just a few weeks. That battle had ended just a few weeks before. But I came away feeling like, a little bit of like the producers and writers of the show are like, well, our audience is dumb and doesn't know what Petersburg is, so we're going to throw out a battle maybe that they've heard of. I think that it would have been much more of a service to all of us of just saying Petersburg, and if the audience doesn't understand, then it's kind of on them to be like, oh, what's Petersburg? This is maybe a learning opportunity. But there's lots of bits like that in this show that just ended up making me angry. And just story is so the actual story is so good. Why are we going off into these kind of pieces of artistic license? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that sort of thing, Rich?
Well, and we had briefly talked about this too. Is if you're going to throw out just, I don't know, some random engagement that's not Petersburg for the sake of trying to relate to a larger audience, why don't you say something like Gettysburg, even, because that happened a little bit sooner than either battle at Manassas or Bull Run, whatever you want to call it. And I, speaking from like kind of a material culture perspective, the uniform that Booth is wearing is not one I believe he would be wearing in 1861, 62 either. But yeah, I don't know. I think all that aside, um, it does show when people start to realize that Booth is not who says he is. He's kind of approaching this situation with a sense of stolen valor. It shows him finally that he's not going to be perceived as the hero that he really thought he was this entire time. Like that's the one thing they really focus on heavily, is the fact that Booth sees himself as, when I go to Richmond, I'm going to be hailed as a god. They're going to publish my journal, and they're going to hail me as the great slayer of this tyrant. I think that's the first time they kind of show him as, well, that's not really what's going to happen. That's not the reality here.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's definitely like him as a character grappling with the fact that, he's realizing he's the villain of the story, not the
Mm-hmm.
hero. And then grappling with that, and then ultimately blaming it on David Harold that we see in the story of, that it was Harold that messed everything up. Um, I will say too that, when we get to the scenes of the trial, it's just lots of lots of insanity. I feel like the show firmly goes off the rails by that point, and it much more resembles just a story of, nothing to do with the history itself. Maybe the loose outlines are there, but it leaves the area of historical fact and wanders off into, I'm not
Right.
even sure. I'm not even sure what it is by episode 7. By that point, I was firmly like just watching this almost for the comedic aspect of it, as opposed to trying to get any serious drama out of the show at that stage.
I,
But I realize I'm being a little overly harsh, so probably
I'm evening it out a little bit.
yeah.
Yeah, I will say with the trial in particular, the fact that we discussed Mary Sims before, who was enslaved by Dr. Samuel Mudd. She does speak at the trial. Of course, they kind of they diverted from the true storyline when they have Mary Sims being at the Mudd farm when John Wilkes Booth had arrived. She, in fact, had left the summer prior in 1864. Um, so had never really come into contact with John Wilkes Booth when he was on the Mudd farm. Um, However, she is brought in for the trial testifying against Dr. Mudd and proving his association with Confederate forces or the Confederate government. And you know, her brother, who was actually assaulted um, by Dr. Mudd as well, I believe he is also someone who's testifying at that trial. So that's one thing that they semi accurately portray. Um, and but aside from that, yeah, like you said, it kind of does go off the rails quite a bit. It is sensationalized quite a bit as well.
Yeah, so I want to pivot now a little bit to talk about kind of the legacy of Manhunt. What do you think, this is going to do for public perceptions around the Lincoln assassination, the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, Reconstruction? Do you think this is going to have any lasting impact on kind of popular culture, and the public's view of this time period in history?
My hope, my hope is that with all of its faults, this show might at least pique the interest of people to actually want to go out and do their own research and learn the true story. Maybe they'll actually read the actual book Manhunt, which will provide them with some more factual information. Um, and that's I think that's what a lot of Hollywood films and media will do for the public. I mean, Glory for it's my favorite Civil War movie of all time. Also has many faults. However, this great movie that also has historical inaccuracies had driven people to want to do their own research to learn the fuller story. Same deal with Gettysburg or Killer Angels, you name it. These are all things that, while us as historians kind of pick them apart, um, do serve some kind of purpose in piquing the interest of a larger audience that we otherwise might not reach at, I don't know, some kind of conference or a public history program. You know what I mean? Um, More people probably have a subscription to Apple TV than people who are visiting a particular historical site associated with John Wilkes Booth and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Rich. Just that this is, presenting this story to people who may not necessarily, be seeking it out elsewhere, and maybe will intrigue them into looking into the real story, and then they'll be pleasantly surprised to find out that the real story is much more interesting than what they saw in the show. Um, I will just conclude, and I'm very happy to be leaving Manhunt in the past. I'll be honest. But I think that it failed in a lot of regards as a series to really tell this story well. But I think I'll conclude our section on Manhunt with a quote from Lincoln. You might recognize this, but I'm going to try to do it in the reedy voice that you get from the actor who played it in Manhunt. The world will little note nor long remember this rather dreadful miniseries.
That's more of a Reagan.
Yeah. It's not high enough for the Lincoln that they're trying to do. But yeah, I think that's a good phrase for it. The world will little note nor long remember Manhunt, the miniseries on Apple TV Plus. I think that's where we're going to leave this section. We're going to pivot now to talk about topic number 2 for this week's episode. And that is a fascinating kind of investigative series that NPR has been working on over the last couple of months, and it has been released out into the world over the last week. This is an investigation into historical markers across the United States and how history is often warped by these roadside markers that have been placed by thousands of private organizations and individuals, government entities, businesses, and a lot of individual property owners have placed these as well. We're going to put a link to the very interesting interview from NPR's Up First show with Laura Sullivan, who is the reporter who conducted a lot of this research. She dives into more than 180,000 historical markers across the United States. And in this show for Up First, she pulled out a few examples that represented a wide range of effects of how these markers have had impacts on their local communities, how people are fighting over these markers today, and ultimately how this impacts the public's memory of historic events that have taken place in those places around the United States. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Rich. I know both you and I have some experience with working on and placing historical markers and wayside interpretation. I was really wondering what you thought about this article and this investigative piece.
So I loved it. I like the fact that they are not just approaching, the hot topic of Confederate monumentation, which of course a lot of people have become more familiar with over the last 5, 10 years or so. Uh, they also approach monumentation in regards to how Native Americans are portrayed, especially in Midwestern states, and even some obscure stuff. But it goes to show that really anybody can kind of, if you have enough clout, you have enough money, you have enough support, you can erect a monument to pretty much anything. So just because you see a monument or a marker does not necessarily mean that is a um, uh, that is a piece of history or historical fact. It's somebody's interpretation of it. It's one side of a story, and I have a bunch of different ones that I could share if you want me to, from my experiences living in the Deep South, in South Carolina in particular. But yeah, this is something that happens more often than people realize. Is you're getting one side of a story, and then that eventually becomes the gospel and becomes people's understanding of it. So, kind of tying it back to what we were just discussing about Manhunt, this is something that sometimes, with people who are maybe a little bit more enlightened, it might lead them to explore the fuller story. However, for people who aren't so much, they might take that at face value and believe that this is the full story.
Yeah, I thought it was one of the smartest takes from this episode of Up First with Laura Sullivan that I was really like made me really start thinking about this was looking at these historical markers as being like, especially in the early 20th century, as being like equivalent to social media posts about history today, where it's like these are very much just individuals' perspectives or maybe a local group, and this is their narrative and this is the story they are telling in their communities about their history. And it, just like social media posts about history, it may or may not, most likely not, have any bearing or any basing in actual fact. And so we get a lot in this about kind of lost cause um, narratives of the Civil War. This is kind of the first section of her story and of her investigation are, the ways that race is talked about in the South on these historical markers, and the lost cause is kind of uh, oftentimes, rife through monumentation or through monuments and markers erected by groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy that have really strictly written in, especially in the early 20th century, that in their documents, communications between groups, what they're putting out through schools, and what they're putting on monuments is a lost cause narrative. The things saying things like, enslaved people were happy in their lot of being enslaved, and that, the war, the Civil War was a war of Northern aggression, was these narratives that we have heard time and time and time again are written onto the landscape of the South. But like you said, Rich, I think too. I think what is really well done about this investigation is it takes it out of that time period that has become kind of central to the narrative of talking about monuments and historical markers in America, and then moves it and shifts it elsewhere in the country to talk about how we talk about interactions between white European settlers in the Midwest and Native American groups, and how the story has been really written onto the landscape through historical markers. That is really a warped view of the history, a very one-sided view of the history, and how there are actively groups out there who are working to change that, to tell a fuller version on the landscape. I think, Rich, I have another question for you. Just, knowing your public history background, what do you see as the value of historical markers on the landscape? Like, what is the importance of place to telling these stories that, in when historical markers are done well, what is the value that you see it bringing to the public and interacting with history?
Sure. So, I think, well, I mean, I live in Gettysburg, so the landscape is littered with monuments. I mean, I'm looking at one right outside my window right now. And when looking for, say, historical context in terms of a battlefield, where when you're looking at troop placements, things like that. It provides some kind of context, a little bit of historical context, when trying to visualize what's happening, say, in Gettysburg in July 1863. When it comes to interpreting things like the Lost Cause or Reconstruction, a lot of that requires a little bit more of reading between the lines. For example, in this piece in particular, they even mentioned, I believe, the Hayward Shepherd Monument in Harper's Ferry, which is still there today. You can still see it today, and I mean, this thing's kind of an abomination. The United Daughters of the Confederacy had dedicated this monument, and the Sons of Confederate Veterans dedicated this monument, um, essentially portraying this man Hayward Shepherd, who was actually a free African American man, who's mistakenly killed by some of John Brown's raiders in October 1859. Um, Portrays him as part of their narrative in the Lost Cause movement as uh, kind of the face of the loyal slave narrative, portraying African Americans as being content and happy with their state of enslavement. And there's so many things that are wrong with it. In fact, during the dedication ceremony um, in 1931, the chorus director for Storr College, which was an all African American college in Harpers Ferry, whose father was a veteran of the 29th Connecticut Infantry, which was a black regiment during the Civil War, she actually rises up and vocalizes all the things that she sees wrong with this monument. Um, you know, and this is one of thousands across the American South that we see. I mentioned just a little bit ago some that I'd come in close contact with while living in South Carolina. A lot of these are raised toward the end of Reconstruction, toward the end of the 19th century, even the early 20th century, and usually creating some kind of narrative. One in particular that comes to mind is in North Augusta, South Carolina, which is a community formerly known as Hamburg, where in July of 1876, white supremacists murdered eight African American men in cold blood, African American militiamen. You know, they attacked them, and in the process of this attack, one white man goes down, gets shot early on in the fight, and for these nine people that die on July 8th, 1876, who do you think has the one monument? The one white guy. Um, and of course, his the community members that he belonged to are the ones that erect the monument. It's a giant obelisk standing prominently in North Augusta, South Carolina today. And of course, they're pretty blunt with the way they describe him and the things that he's fighting for, with which are, in their words, Anglo-Saxon values. So some of these monuments are very literal with the way they describe um, the people are honoring, and some, like I said, you have to kind of look between the lines to completely understand the story they're trying to craft here. um, so it, Going back to the one in Harper's Ferry, for a long time that monument stood alone, no context whatsoever.
The National Park Service, Harpers Ferry National Historical Park, actually put up a interpretive wayside marker just feet away from that monument, telling the story that I just relayed to you about the chorus director from Storer College, giving a little bit of context to the story this monument was trying to tell through the United Daughters of the Confederacy.
Yeah, Rich, that really brought to mind two things for me, things to keep in mind when, going and listening and reading through the NPR investigation, but also just when you see historical markers on the landscape. One is that, you know, looking at these monuments and these markers as a piece of their era. They are themselves historical documents. They are themselves, they tell us a lot about the time period in which they were erected as well, the values of the people who put them up. The values of the people who are telling their stories, and ultimately, what were their goals by putting that monument or that marker onto the landscape? What were they trying to convey to others in their time, to contemporaries, but also to future generations as well. And then I think the second part is, and especially when it gets to the Storer College story and the Hayward Shepherd Monument in Harper's Ferry, is that it's not the past, especially when it comes to these contentious topics that we look around today and see, oh, there's a lot of debate going on about things like Civil War, Reconstruction, the lost cause. Um, and we need to remember that when these monuments and markers are going up in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was still being, it's not a, people weren't thinking as a monolith here. It's not everyone was like, oh yeah, these monuments are fine, these markers are fine. There's a lot of fighting that goes on, arguing, uh countless gallons of newspaper ink spilled in debates about these monuments and these markers and what they meant and whether or not they were right. And there's a huge debate that's going on in that time period, and still kind of an ongoing fight between North and South, between Unionists, the veterans themselves, their descendants, fighting over what the war was about and who could control and who would control the historical narrative moving into the mid to late 20th century and in towards our own time period today. These are things that are always in flux. And I think that's an important part of thinking about these markers, these historical markers, is kind of the ebbs and flows of history. History is not always one thing, it is always being rewritten. It is always being understood through the lens of our own experiences and what we are living through today. So I think that is conveyed very well through this series, and through NPR's work on this. So I've been really gratified to listen to this and learn some really fascinating news stories, and just to get a public conversation going about our history and about how it's conveyed on these historical markers that are ubiquitous on the landscape. I think is really well done by NPR. I think that I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the series as it continues to come out.
As am I. I just want to throw one more thing out there. As we're talking about these public memorials, markers, monuments, you name it, is that when you see these things go up, there usually is some kind of motivation to put them up. There is some kind of inspiration to put them up. So, and this is something I got got into the habit of years ago. Once I started learning these things, there usually is some kind of motivation, that there's not just like, a historical fact that we're putting up there. Is that there's some other documentation out there that talks about these monuments, um, about the people who put them up. You have to look up the context of it, the groups who put them up. What is their motivation for it? Um, I encourage anybody who sees that marker on the side of the road, if you're interested in it, don't just take a photo of the marker and call it a day. If you want to learn the full story, look up the background of the marker, look up who raised the money and was drafting the text for these markers, and you'll learn so much more than just kind of what you get at face value there on the side of the highway.
Absolutely. Well said, Rich. I think that's where we're going to leave our second topic, final topic of the episode. we're going to move into our final segment. One of my favorite parts of this podcast on a week-to-week basis is Postscript. This is where we each share an experience, something we've read, something we've watched over the last week that's left an impression on us. I think I might know what Rich's is, but I'll let him answer that. I think he has some good possibilities. I'm very curious to hear what he says for this. But Rich, what is your postscript this week? We'll see if I'm right.
So, nothing too exciting. I ran my first half marathon on Sunday.
Got it.
Did you
That's
get
what
it?
I was.
Okay.
That's what I was assuming it was going to be. This is huge. Also, congratulations, Rich.
Thank you. For anybody who knows me, I actually kind of hate running, but I do it so I don't die or get severely overweight. And if you know my family history, you'd understand. But anyway, my friend Chris Barr came up from South Carolina. We made a pact essentially a while ago that while I was living in South Carolina, that if I were to come up here, and I'll be honest, the mountain air is a lot more friendly to my lungs than the low country humidity. If I were to come up here and sign up for a half marathon, he would drive the 12 hours from Beaufort, South Carolina, and run that half marathon with me. And so we both stuck to our word. He came up this past weekend. We ran the Gettysburg half marathon, 13.1 miles. I have the bumper sticker to prove it. It's not in my car though. Sorry, Chris. Ran 13.1 miles from a little bit south of Gettysburg, actually past the Mason-Dixon line and back. Yes, my legs did hurt for several days afterward, but I felt accomplished, and I felt pretty good about myself. Every other day I try to do 2-3 miles or so, running on the battlefield, and I am getting a little bit more accustomed to it. But that is my big news for the week.
That is awesome, Rich. Congratulations on finishing that.
Thank you.
I am very excited to be running my second official half marathon this weekend in Frederick, Maryland, where I live. So Frederick Running Festival. So I'm pretty excited, a little bit nervous about that as well. Been in training as well. Rich and I have done some training runs going a ways back to earlier this year. So excited to see him finish his run and excited to take on mine this week. My postscript this week is an experience I had over the weekend. I am a long-suffering Everton fan. So those of you that might know anything about the English Premier League will probably know something about Everton's sufferings over the last couple of years. A club that has a long and storied history in English soccer or football, and has in recent years suffered some disappointments, and quite frankly been quite scary about staying in the Premier League. One of the things I love about English football and European football, soccer, is the relegation system, which is basically the top, the bottom three or bottom four of different leagues will actually get dropped to the league below. So think of it as like if the Baltimore Orioles were playing in the major leagues and they had a terrible season, in the system that they have in England, they would get dropped. If you finished in the last three places in Major League Baseball, you would be dropped to AAA and be playing minor league baseball. So it's a really interesting system. Everton has been flirting with getting dropped to the league below the Premier League for the last several years. And last year they won their final game of the season, and that's how they survived relegation. This year they secured survival in the Premier League for another year, a whole month early. And I had the opportunity to see them do that in Philadelphia at an official club bar, O'Neill's Pub on South Street in Philadelphia. So I got to hang out with my fellow Everton supporters and cheer them on to victory against Brentford and securing survival in the Premier League for another season. So they'll be playing in the Premier League in 2024 and 2025. I hope that this also means happier days are on their way. So So that's my postscript for this week. So excited to share some of my love for English football with you all. All right, so we're gonna leave it there for the evening. Rich, do you have any final thoughts before we throw it into our conclusion?
I don't have any final thoughts, but I do want to thank you for having me on again here. I'm glad we got to kind of round things out with the manhunt discussion, as well as talking about one of my bigger interests, and which is monumentation and memory. So thanks for kind of looping me in on that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you so much, Rich, for coming on. We'll have you back on in the future. I know we have some cool things that you're doing in the public history world. Some writing about public history, the field of public history as it revolves around the Civil War. So we're eager and excited to have you back on in the future. Thank you all out there for listening to this week's show. If you are liking the show, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and don't forget to rate and review the show. That'll help more people join in the discussion. If you're listening in over on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and a comment with your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you think about the topics that we're talking about. So until next time, this is Jake Wynn signing off from this week's episode of Public History with Jake and Justin.